Our next speaker is not an academic. He comes from industry, even though he does have an academic background, is Dr. Bryan, who is president and CEO of MPSI Systems, and that's an international retail analytics consultancy. Now, Bryan's background is very much in ecosystems and ecological modeling. And in fact, what he has been doing is he has been applying this ecological modeling to consumer behavior and retail, and he has been looking at retail from a scientific setting. And I'm saying all this because it gives you the context for his talk, which is retail consumer behavior and network complexity, interaction and organization.
Thank you very much. Is this volume fine? Yeah, thank you. I fully understand the danger of being the last presenter during the course of the day when the social hour is calling. I'll try to make it worth your while, and if I don't, feel free to approach me later on and tell me that I didn't. One of the things that I've noticed that a lot of the speakers have brought to light over the course of the day and in conversations with a lot of people is everybody who seems to be pursuing this field started out somewhere else. And 20 years ago, I would have never have imagined that I would have any interest at all in retail or consumer behavior. My interest was in ecosystem modeling of population dynamics, of the way ecosystems evolve and populations and species evolve. As I left graduate school and I got into the private sector, entered the private sector and started pursuing retail and consumer behavior, I realized they were very much the same thing. Basically, the development of a retail marketplace is very much like the development of an ecosystem. And the behavior of consumers in a marketplace, although it sounds a little strange, is very much like the resources upon which predators and prey feed in a marketplace, with the predators and prey being the retail sites, the retail stores, the retail outlets. So the whole study of the marketplace, the retail marketplace, the consumer marketplace, is very much a study of ecosystems. And so what I really wanted to talk about today was complexity in consumer behavior. And the things I wanted to hit on were basically consumers themselves, how they behave, the impact of their behavior on retail, how to assess that behavior, how to manage that once we assess that, and then how to use it in retail planning. Now, I don't really want this to sound like a sales presentation, but it very much has to be seen that to a certain degree because basically we're very interested in application. And more than just application of these kinds of concepts in the study of retail, we're interested in commercial application. And so everything we do, every time we look at a new technology, every time we build a new model, every time we study something, we really have to put it in the context of commercial viability. So I thought to begin with it would be important that I at least establish our credibility for even talking about this subject, given that we are not academic and we may be seen a little bit outside what's going on here today. But this is very much the kinds of things that interest us. MPSI is a market leader, global market leader in retail and consumer science. We very much focus on the idea of trying to take consumer behavior, retail behavior, market behavior, and put it in a framework, a conceptual framework, an analytical framework of the scientific method. And as far as we know, that's one of the things that's been lacking in a lot of consumer science, a lot of consumer behavior, a lot of retail management, is really putting it in a robust, disciplined, orderly, kind of analytical school of thought. And that's what we're very much interested in doing. We have a lot of experience in this. We've been in the business of producing these kinds of technologies for 30 years, for over 30 years. We have clients around the globe in multiple retail sectors, all the way from motor fuels, commercial C-stores, banking, postal services, We cover a pretty wide gambit, and that's what we feel gives us the credibility to talk about consumer behavior. We have some very large clients spread out around the globe, and over the course of our history, we've modeled well over 2 million retail locations and the consumers that drive the performance of those retail locations. So we have some credibility in terms of talking about the way consumers behave and how to assess that behavior. We've learned a couple of things in the 34 years of studying consumers. Basically what we know, and I know these may sound ridiculously simple, but you would be surprised as you deal with some retailers and some clients in the retail industry how these kinds of things are forgotten. What we try to emphasize to our clients, for example, is that it is consumers that drive retail. And our assumption really has to be is that they drive that retail by making logical decisions. If their decisions were largely random, there would be no opportunity for us to apply scientific method to their behavior. We have to assume, and we know from after that assumption of testing that assumption, that they make their decisions in a very logical manner based upon logical needs. And we'll talk about those needs in a little bit. And we know that successful retailers create profit from their ability to meet the needs of the consumers in a logical fashion. So really the idea is that if consumers can be found to behave logically and they're responding to logical needs and we can assess those needs and then we can meet those needs, we can be successful in the retail marketplace. Now, there are a number of questions that have to be answered by a retailer about consumers. We have to know who they are, what they buy, when they buy it, where they buy it, how they buy it, why they buy it, and how much they buy when they buy. The ability to answer those questions and then to manage accordingly after answering those questions is the difference between retail success and failure. I have a mentor from years back who was a retailer who basically told me, kind of a Yogi Berra, if you're familiar with that character figure, that said the basic difference between retailers and non-retailers is their ability to retail. Brilliant. But it really is true, and the ability to retail comes from the ability to assess consumers and meet their needs and think about consumers. We know then that consumers are driven by logical, and we'll talk about that again, but complex interactions. So even though they make logical decisions, or we assume they do, and our experience shows that they do, and our analysis shows they do, they're very, very complex. And in fact, we use a conceptual framework, a conceptual model to really describe that kind of behavior. And it's really what we refer to as a retail or consumer value chain. It's a group of interlinked needs that really drive the performance of retail. And the reason we use the chain as a conceptual model is that we often say that your retail operation is only going to be as strong as the weakest link in the retail value chain. So if we're looking at consumer behavior and consumers making buying decisions based upon the location of a retail facility, the facility itself, the physical characteristics, the price of products, the merchandising of those products, the operations that surround those products, the brand of that network, and the competition that network or that particular store faces. If any of those things are broken, if any of those things are weak, then the whole performance chain falls apart. We're often asked the question of how much volume would I do in my store if I put it in the right location? And we often say none and infinity, because basically you won't do any volume if you don't operate correctly. But you'll do tremendous volume if you fill the rest of the retail value chain to meet consumer needs. We also know that consumers vary by particular geographies, particular products. So when we look at the retail value chain and the importance of these various factors, we know market by market, product by product, consumer by consumer, that each of those has a different sensitivity. And so what we know when we build a model for a particular setting, we have to take into account the heterogeneity of consumer behavior and consumer needs. It makes it even more complex. The task of the retailer, as we discussed before, is to match their offer their retail offer to the needs of the consumer. And in fact, that ability to do that is really a game that is a match game in terms of fitting your offer, the demand or the volume you have to supply to the demand. And so if we look at different kinds of consumer segmentation, consumer behavior, and it really is a function of a lot of the things that Chris talked about this morning. Basically, segmentation systems, expenditure systems, are very often a function of the way consumers interact with other consumers in space. It's really the concept of the way a disease spreads through a community is the same way that a buying behavior spreads through the community. It's very much a proximal kind of situation. Consumers can start to behave like other consumers based upon their proximity to those consumers. It very much explains segmentation systems if you're familiar with those. So basically, if we look at different kinds of needs across a marketplace, we can assess the needs of the consumer. The category demand in this particular situation, a very applied example of here's beer, wine, tobacco, candies, coffee, pastries, fast food, milk and dairy in a convenience store setting. We can look at the demand in a particular area for those particular products. And we can look at the way stores match that demand. And we can assess then what's likely to be a successful store and an unsuccessful store by how close that retailer matches the needs of the consumer. And in fact, we know from experience, we know from examples, that the closer the match relative to competition, the better the likelihood for retail success. It's also true when we look at those concepts of the retail value chain, location, traffic, facility, merchandising, price, brand, operations. Consumers have specific importance associated with each of those. The ability of retailers to match those will determine the probability of success of that retailer. And in this case, we know from example that the higher the percentage goodness of fit, which we can quantify, the more likelihood of success. Now, we often get the question that, and this is one of the driving forces behind a lot of the retail analysis that we are asked to do, is boil down the consumer to the simplest kinds of things that determine their behavior. And so, for example, we know from those of us who practice in retail know that the most important thing about retail, or the top three important things about retail is your location, and your location. And so we would guess that if we were to map retail store performance against the strength of location, a function of the demand in an area, we should have see a positive relationship. As our location improves, our performance improves. If we look at actual data, and this is a representation of over 30,000 retail sites in a particular sector of the industry across the globe, we see a fairly broad scatter. And if we fit a linear model to that, we can see that across the globe, less than 1% of consumer behavior is driven by location. So here is the most fundamental paradigm or assumption or hypothesis behind consumer behavior, that location is important to them. And when we do the test, we cannot go back to our client and say, yes, it is. Because we can only predict less than 1% of their behavior based upon that. I take a big risk here putting a price graph up in the London School of Economics, but we are often asked, or we are often told, that price is the thing that is driving consumers. And we would expect, then, store performance to degrade as price increases. When we plot the data, here is a different retail sector for 42,000 retail stores across the globe and all the consumers that drive their behavior. When we plot the information, it's nice. We see a price elasticity curve starting to take shape. But even when we fit a nonlinear equation to that, we barely account for 1% of the variability in retail performance by one of the most fundamental drivers of what we would consider consumer behavior. So this simple idea that there are primary drivers and consumers behave in a very predictable, simple manner is just not valid. What we do know is that when we put together the retail value chain, these component parts of consumer behavior, and we link them together in nonlinear ways, we can expect a certain kind of behavior. We can expect consumers to respond positively to increasing locations and increasing facility strength and better merchandising and more aggressive pricing and better brand. We would expect a positive relationship. When we plot the data, we do indeed see a positive relationship between these components all put together and the way retail stores are performing, which indicates how consumers are responding to that performance. If we fit a model to that, a global linear model, this is a model where we've taken out the effect of regional specific kinds of needs and desires by the consumer, and we fit it with a linear model, we can account for 30% of the variability in retail store performance with a linear equation using these as the predictor variables. If we fit a nonlinear model, now making these multiplicative rather than additive, we can account for nearly 70% of the behavior of retail facilities in this particular sector, and this tends to be perennially true across all retail sectors. Once we do this, we can start predicting a very high degree. So we're getting more complex. We're predicting better and better the behavior of retail sites, which we're using as the experimental unit for measuring consumer behavior. If we then fit a regional nonlinear model, where we've now allowed the model to calibrate by particular marketplace, Chicago versus London versus Paris, and consumers have different kinds of behavior, we can accurately project 81% or account for 81% of the variability in store performance. And a lot of the conversations earlier today have dealt with location, proximal effects, distance effects. If we add to this the effect of competition, before we were just looking at each store's ability to meet customer needs, now what we're doing is we're looking at their ability to meet customer needs as compared to proximal competition. We can account for 93% of the variability associated with retail store performance. So that as the models get more and more complex, we can do a better job of predicting what consumers are going to do, and by kind of an inferential approach, we can make an assumption that consumers are very, very complex creatures. Logical, but complex. In fact, if we look at this, what we really see is a building block of activities. We see that as we build the retail value chain, we can see that we can do better and better at predicting performance. And we know by this that consumers are neither satisfied nor enticed by simple retail solutions, which is really the business that we're in. We are in the business of trying to help retailers understand how to be better retailers. And this is the message that we send to them. Not always successfully and not always happily, but it is the message. It's intuitive that the better one meets the needs of customers, the better the chance of retail success. But it's really only science. It's really only this thing put in a scientific setting because of its complexity that allows assessment of those complex needs. Retail science then provides the robust, objective, disciplined, repeatable approach to trying to unravel consumer complexity issues. Now, when I first entered the private sector and started dealing with the retail problem, I started to utilize some of the very sophisticated classical academic analysis and modeling techniques I had always used in an academic setting, to little success. And I won't say that I've sold my soul, but I put it up for rent so to speak, in trying to figure out how to apply these concepts, these mathematical academic concepts, to the retail setting and really to the commercial setting. Because after all, we have to be able to develop models and systems and analytical solutions that customers can use and need. In fact, we develop commercial simulation systems that our clients run, not just that we run in-house on servers and run stochastic simulations and then deliver those. We have to be able to deliver things that are more deterministic in nature. So we try to take very advanced techniques, it's why we're in association with the Santa Fe Institute, try to take their very advanced techniques and almost with a very large hammer pound them into something that we can use commercially. And this is a very difficult concept for us because we try to recruit our analysts, our modelers out of the academic setting. And it's very difficult for them to make the transition to real world. In fact, the first time we typically hand a real world data set over to a statistician who's been classically trained, it's the look on their face when they come back with an R-square in a first analysis of 0.1 and we say, hey, nice job. It's not a very happy environment initially for them, but once they start to make the transition and they pick up the passion for applying their art, their science to this, they really start to catch on to the concept of what it means to take classical approaches and fit them to real world problems. So we use a whole group of certain kinds of models, so to speak, to try to apply science to retail. We of course use data, and we know that the quality of data is important in defining or being able to ascertain a solution to a retail problem. And instead of typically using available data and then finding a solution or a technique that can use it, what we have a tendency to want to do, and we try to do this as often as we can, is develop the technique that solves a problem and then create the database, collect the data, very much like the scientific method, that helps address that issue, that fits into that technology. It's not always easy, it's not always viable, but it really works better in that kind of setting, in that kind of order. Geographic information systems are of course everywhere now. And I don't think there's anyone who hasn't at some point in time in a retail setting or a scientific setting in what we're doing used a geographic information system. So that provides information. Statistical methods are always good solutions. And the nice thing about statistical methods is the simpler the statistical method, typically the better the solution. That's the nice thing about the classical statistics. We apply those in segmentation systems by using analoguing and clustering techniques. We can create spatial interaction variables and use nonlinear regression techniques. So a lot of statistical techniques, even as simple as building confidence intervals to test differences in consumer behavior. The simpler the statistical technique, the better off we are because the easier it is to explain to our retail customer. And in fact, recently we had a question from a retail customer who asked, what is the likelihood of hypermarkets invading various markets in the U.S. and to what degree will it impact our retail network? And our solution was to do Monte Carlo simulation where we invaded the market hundreds of thousands of times with hypermarkets and were able to explain to them exactly how robust their existing retail network would be against that invasion. And they said no. Couldn't you just do a t-test? Well, we get into a situation where they can explain a t-test. They can explain even a time series forecast. They cannot explain to their management the connotation of a Monte Carlo simulation or stochastic simulation. So very much we're limited in our techniques by the ability of our customer to understand those techniques. It's not the best situation, not the ideal situation, but it's the real situation. We also use spatial interaction methods, and we've applied agent-based technologies in our spatial interaction methods, and that really is one of the best techniques for addressing or explaining and predicting consumer behavior in a retail marketplace. Luckily, there's been a lot of discussion today about the power of agents, the power of agent-based modeling, but basically what we do is we start by modeling the individual retail site or the individual consumer or some aggregated set of consumers, and by modeling those and allowing them to interact spatially and through the retail value chain, we're able to then build a model of the retail system. And the nice thing is we can start with fairly simple equations at this level and see more complex behavior from the system as we group it into a high-level system-type simulation. And it's important because what we found is that agent-based technology in context of spatial interaction technology really allows us to do two things. It allows us both to predict consumer behavior and also explain consumer behavior. And those of you who have done just pure regression models and come up with the best prediction models understand that that doesn't mean it always explains what's happening. And so we require that these systems both explain and predict, and we found that the marriage of these technologies works out very well. I'm going to keep my eye on my watch here since I know we're on a tight schedule. Basically, what we've achieved from agent-based technology married with spatial interaction is that these models do a very nice job of modeling and explaining the interrelated needs of the consumer, the nonlinear responses of those consumers, the way they self-organize into either transient flow systems or segmentation systems. These models do a very nice job of explaining that type of behavior. They explain very well the feedback of retail on consumers, consumers on retail. In this particular setting, it's very much like a genetic kind of situation where the environment can drive the population, and the population can modify its environment. And so what we very often see is that as retailers change their offer, they can impact consumer behavior, consumer demand. And as consumers change their demand or their needs, they of course impact retail offer. So we see these feedback mechanisms. We see adaptation. We can model adaptation now. We can look at the way consumers are likely to change over time as new things happen. We can do that through simulation. And we can take into account the spatial interaction, the ability of sites to impact other sites, of consumers to impact other consumers. Agent-based retail modeling provides really one of the best techniques for accurately and realistically explaining consumer behavior, very complex behavior. One of the examples that I'd like to talk about really is what's referred to in retail as the network effect, the brand network effect. The idea that as you build a network of retail stores, retail facilities, you can actually create a synergy of those facilities across time. We call it critical mass. And as retail stores enter a marketplace through an invasion strategy, and they build their number or their outlet share, whatever it may be, they can actually create nonlinear feedback in their performance, in their per-store performance. If we use static methods, even spatial interaction systems, basically when we try to project that behavior, what we typically see is a degradation of average facility performance. Because basically what happens is the model starts exchanging consumers amongst other consumers, and we see sites cannibalizing other sites as they add sites, and average volume has a tendency to erode. By using agent-based techniques with feedback mechanisms, we can actually simulate the growth of demand and the adaptation and change of consumers across time as new offers are added to the marketplace, and in fact with a very high level of accuracy. That would not be possible if agent-based techniques had not come along and made available to us. The real question then becomes, is this ability to predict accurately and realistically a case for planning? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Because we have a problem in a retail setting because of the number of ways things can be combined. And it really has to do with the fact that when you're accurately forecasting or realistically forecasting consumer behavior, There are so many different ways that they can respond, and there are so many different ways you can meet their needs that it becomes a virtually impossible task. This is an actual example of that kind of difficulty. We have a client who's a multinational retailer who's very aggressive in their network planning, what we refer to as retail network planning, their ability to find locations, build those locations, format those stores, price, merchandise, operate in order to meet customer needs. Very aggressive network planner. They were looking at a growth market, and they were looking at 150 potential new locations, new stores to go to the market. They only had a quota of 6 stores per year. That's what they could construct each year. And they had a deadline of 8 months to put together a 3-year plan. They were able, using simulation techniques, they were able to develop and simulate 3 plans per day, putting in all the characteristics of the retail facilities, where they were going to be placed, the latitude, longitude, run the simulation, look at the results, assess those results, modify, do competitive response to those new stores going in, how would competitors price, so on and so forth. They were able to run, over the course, they were able to run approximately 500 different plans, and they selected one of those plans. Unfortunately, there were over 14 billion possible plans to be evaluated. So basically, they were only able to look at a very, very small proportion of the possible solutions to that network, and it took them 8 months to do it. The problem became is that every time they presented a plan, or presented this plan, one person could ask one question and the whole plan would be destroyed. One person could say, but what if Walmart goes right there? That plan just went into the trash basket. And so when it came down to it, with the amount of money involved in implementing a network plan, rolling it out in the market, there were just too many unknowns in this 8-month process. And so they never implemented the plan. All that work, never implemented. That's where optimization comes in. We've got a very, very sophisticated technology called agent-based spatial interaction modeling to really assess very complex behavior of a retail marketplace and the consumers in that marketplace. But it really doesn't get us where we need to be in terms of actual application of those plans, development application. So what we found is while models really allow us to predict, optimization allows us to find best solutions. And so if we can figure out a way to marry models and optimization techniques, we can come up with best predictive solutions. And after all, the first part of any planning or strategy is to come up with the predicted solution before you ever roll something out into the marketplace and take the risk. It's a risk management game. When we look at different optimization techniques, a lot are available, and it was not by plan that we developed a technology that fits so well into a lot of the discussions about genetic algorithms here today and genetic concepts of complexity. But really, when you take a look at a retail network, it's really like a string of DNA. And each store is like a gene on that string. When genetic algorithms are married to the agent-based simulation models, we can evaluate, select, recombine networks of stores and maximize fitness from millions of evolving combinations. And in fact, it really, when we throw this problem at the network problem with 14 billion possible combinations, we find that the genetic algorithm married to the spatial interaction can reduce dramatically the number of things we have to consider because it looks at ever-improving solutions rather than just purely random solutions. As an example, that's our theory. As an example, we've been employing this technology to meet client needs. This is just one example of that. In 2003, we were contracted to develop a retail plan for a major global retailer in a large U.S. market. Global retailer, but they picked a U.S. market. This market had over 9 million consumers, had 2,000 competitors, and 300 client sites, client stores. What we saw in the marketplace for that client over a period of time that we had been studying that market on their behalf, we saw that they were undergoing an erosion of their position, their market share, their total volume as a proportion of other network brand volumes in the market. And that was forecast through time series forecast, and we forecast that, and not hard to see the linear trend there, that would continue to erode unless they did something. So salvation strategies were developed by that client. They decided to invest $300 million in that market to try to save it, to try to turn it around. They identified from their 300 company-owned, company-operated retail outlets a set of candidates, a set of tactics, strategies to apply at a site-specific level. They had 90 candidates for tearing them down and building them up again, 50 just to reface or reimage, 200 candidates that they were willing to get rid of or consider to get rid of to other brands, considering 65 that they were willing to close, 193 that they protected, and they protected those because those were franchisees and they couldn't do anything about them, but they would consider some of those franchisees for other kinds of strategies, and 40 new locations. Big number of possible things to consider, and a lot of different solutions out there. There was no possible way for this client to conduct a manual network planning process, even with the best of retail simulation technologies. So, optimization provides a solution. Basically, by using optimization, genetic optimization in this particular example, it allowed them to expedite their planning cycle from 8 months to about 6 weeks. It allowed them, of course, to consider more of the possibilities, more of the possible solutions. It significantly reduced the labor because it basically took a team of about 20 to 25 planners and reduced it to about 5. Those are the individuals that were involved. It increased the objectivity, decreased the subjectivity of finding that solution. It reduced the planning costs simply by the amount of labor and the amount of time. It would find a better solution. It would better manage the risk if you can come up with a better predictive solution before anything hits the street. And it would, of course, improve their chance of retail success, which is really the end game. They established, for the use of this, their own goals and objectives. And that's the great thing about being able to do this, is that the retail goals and objectives can be very dynamic. The constraints can drive the solution, and the constraints can be very specific to that particular market, to that particular sector, to that particular client. Basically, what they decided to do is they wanted to rationalize their network. They wanted to clean it up. They wanted to get rid of the bad stuff, keep the good stuff, try to really re-energize that network. They wanted to improve the efficiencies of their retail stores under the assumption and valid assumption that if we can improve efficiencies, we can really improve profitability, which is what they wanted to do. That was their ultimate goal. They wanted to maintain their total brand volume, the tough one, because the idea of rationalizing a network, of closing stores in a network but still maintaining total volume, those sound like they're a difficult task, but in combination with the other things that optimization can consider, quite possible, quite feasible. They had threshold levels on economic rate of returns for each individual retail store. They had threshold volumes. They wanted to create throughput, not just profitability, but throughput of volume. And they wanted to find the optimal formats and operations. They wanted to be able to know store by store how it should be priced, what the optimal price is, what the optimal hours of operation, what the optimal store size, everything. They wanted to optimize the entire package, store by store. And they wanted to come in under budget. They said, we have $300 million. We'd sure appreciate it if you could save us some. The way it worked is basically we took all their objectives and all their rules and all their economics, fed it into genetic algorithms. The genetic algorithms generated site strategies, site-specific strategies, which fed the retail model, which in turn ran through iteration after iteration after iteration, and developed an optimal network for that particular market. And in fact, over the course of the simulation, it ran approximately 14 million evolving client store configurations. It analyzed and it was able to minimize that from that 14 billion to only 14 million because it was using genetic algorithms, ever improving the solution. It produced over 250 million different forecasts, not only forecasts for their network, but forecasts for all the competitors in the network, so they knew exactly how they were impacting competitors, the advantage of spatial interaction. And it produced an optimal solution. And basically, the details of that were delivered. Basically, the system found 27 new-to-market client stores with optimal format, 32 raise and rebuilds, 16 reimages, 83 closures, 42 rebrandings, and each of these was identified specifically with an outlet. They had a plan. They could go to market in 6 weeks' time. Basically, the results allowed them, if we look at a couple of different their primary products, these are their primary margin products. If we look at the relationship of their market share to their outlet share, in a market setting we usually see this as an S-curve. We usually see the relationship between market share and outlet share for brands in a marketplace being fit very well by an S-curve. We look at the other brands. We see them starting at a fairly high position on that curve, near saturation, quite honestly. The optimization in conjunction with agent-based technology allowed them to rationalize that network and grow their market share through improvement of facilities, improvement of operations, improvement of pricing relative to competition. If we look at their other primary product, the way they started out was in a very poor position, which is one of the things that was causing a significant erosion to their performance in the marketplace. They were so weak to begin with in one of their primary categories. By running the optimization, given the rules and the economics, basically they were able to minimally improve their outlet share and significantly improve their market share. In fact, across all of the categories, and this is just 3 of those, and I won't mention what the categories are because I don't want to give the client away or even the sector it's in, but basically across the categories, it improved performance. By marrying these technologies, it found the best solution and improved performance across all categories. Interestingly enough, product 1 was the category where all they wanted to do was maintain, and it even improved that. These 2 categories are very high margin categories, so that's their focus. It's where they are fairly weak, and we significantly improved their performance. The same thing was true in market effectiveness. Their market share divided by their outlet share, which is a measure of the effectiveness of each one of their sites in attaining volume. Basically, this allows them to create more efficiencies and, of course, profitability. And across product categories, the technology significantly improved the effectiveness of each and every site in that network. To summarize the case study of optimization and agent-based modeling, basically, we know that the conditions of the marketplace, those baseline conditions for that particular client, and it's true of so many, really demanded action. And that the complexity of the retail setting due to the combinatorials and those kinds of things really demanded best of practice approaches. The best of practice approach was to marry simulation with optimization. It produced, by applying those technologies, it produced an optimal plan, improved their network performance, improved their store-specific performance, improved their volumetric performance, improved their cash flow, reduced cost of market operations by increasing efficiencies, reduced their planning and implementation cycles, and we all know how important it is to be one of the first to market when you're going to market with a plan. And it achieved that goal where they said they wanted to come in under budget. It achieved their goal and saved them $100 million of investment capital. Overall, in summary, Consumers are complex. We know they are. We can see that every time we do an analysis and someone asks us a simple question about what's the effect of price on consumers or location on consumers or facility on consumers, we don't have a clue because they're just too complex. We cannot predict. It's when we put things together that it becomes a more readable, more understandable problem. The need then is to simplify the problem so that we can understand it, and by understanding, manage it. There are two ways to simplify. One is through a simple perspective of just pretending consumers are simple creatures with simple buying behavior, and we see that so many times. We see the focus in retail really being on simple solutions to very complex problems. The other approach is to complexify the methods, which really, when you think about it, adding complex methods to a complex question is really simplification. Because the idea of adding a complex method is to help us partition out the variability in performance of some kind of phenomenon into its component parts, into predictable component parts. Very much a process of simplification. Complex methods help simplify that into quantifiable cause and effect, and really provide the two things we need. We need realism and comprehensive consideration. Oh, I went too far. Excuse me. And what we know now is that retail needs to be a science. It's too expensive. The risk is too great for it to be intuitive, as it has been. It was very much brought to light and struck a chord this morning when we talked about science and where it stands in relation to Tycho Brahe all the way through Newton. And really, retail is the same way. We've been in that phase where it's been very descriptive, very qualitative, very intuitive, and it needs to move into those aspects that are very quantitative, and beyond quantitative, very scientific. My best friend in retail science and trying to teach people in our corporation about the study of retail and the use of scientific methods is Occam's razor. Because basically what I try to do is inform them that don't let it overwhelm you with the complexity of the problem. You really can use simple concepts to try to understand that. But the more I deal with it, the more I realize that that's not true. That's purely a PR concept, because basically we need very complex methods. So if I could take the liberty of adding to that, I would say, though we don't want to complexify beyond need, we certainly don't want to simplify beyond, or complexify beyond necessity. We certainly don't want to complexify beyond, or simplify beyond need. And really, to be honest, we really don't want to simplify beyond reality. And that's really the fundamental driver of this whole technology in retail. I'd be glad to field questions. I think I did what you asked.
Please say who you are first and where you're from.
Isn't it the claim that choices are based on logical needs, a little bit simple, a little bit naive as a perspective?
Well, I think we're all consumers in here.
Yes.
And we basically, if we were behaving purely at random, when we do the actual tests of hypotheses, we would not be able to predict consumer behavior. We would look at these numbers and we would say, okay, initially it looks like in terms of location, consumers are behaving very randomly. But then when we add to it the other component parts and start partitioning out the variability, we can actually see that location is a significant driver of consumer behavior, as is price, as is facility. Consumers are making their decisions very, very logically. Now, one of the things that we're starting to find is that the thing that consumers tend to do is they tend to switch on, switch off. We have an analysis that we do to determine price price elasticity, price sensitivity areas. And basically what we see is consumers switching on, switching off to price as a primary driver. And so basically instead of a nice non-linear continuous, we're starting to see things that look like they're discontinuities in consumer behavior, but still very much logical choices.
This is just a framework called economics framework, which says that humans are rational. They have their own choices, they're following predetermined choices. But there are like almost 1 century of consumer behavior research, which is contradicting actually all this.
All I can say is I fall back on the information, the analysis that we've done over the last 30 years, which indicates if you're measuring the right things, you can predict their behavior.
Yeah, but there's someone behind you actually. Was
Yes.
that a comment?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Which is all you mean in that sense is not people are logical, but somehow predictable. And being predictable is completely different from being logical. So it's not necessarily through rationality either. So it's a mixture of these three fashions. You could be wouldn't have any type of boundary rationality as long as it's predictable. And if your model is accurate, then it's a type of predictable.
So I understand. So the word that you're really concerned about is the word logical. Had the word been predictable, you would be, then I'm fine with that.
I'm unhappy with both, but never mind. Yes.
I'm Seth Wood from University of Leeds. I'm interested that, well, my assumption is it must be hard to justify solutions that were generated automatically. The objection that you raised to, or you told an anecdote where some board members objected to a proposed solution by saying, well, what if Walmart opened something there? And the people with the suggestion didn't know how to respond. Because you've used an automatic optimization approach to generate your solution, I wonder whether you have a rationale to explain why it's a good solution in that situation.
What we were able to do is track multiple solutions and deliver multiple solutions so that if they, and also deliver to them a database by which they could compare new questions, new simulations. The question on the Walmart under a manual network planning process very often demonstrates that the network plan is suboptimal. Now, when you apply these kinds of technologies, it allows you to already investigate those kinds of things. When that question comes up in the boardroom setting, the simulation can be run and it can be demonstrated that indeed it is the Walmart opening up, it is still an optimal solution in that setting.
I have a question here, and then you, yes.
Just following that up, I think what we're trying to get at is once you've got this solution from the genetic process, in a sense it's like a black box solution. It's optimal, but can you kind of tie it back to the driving factors of the process, like price, location, and so on? Can you essentially turn that optimization back into, in quotes, a kind of regression type analysis?
As we deliver, the nice thing about the optimization is as we deliver a solution, we can deliver all the solutions up to that as well. So basically you can look at all the other solutions, and there are statistics that are associated, of course, with each of the retail facilities in an optimal solution. You can look at the strength of location, the strength of facility, the strength of competition, the strength of price in a spatial setting. You can look at the relationship of the brand performance to all other network plans, the performance or the fitness measure in all other network plans. So it's not at all a black box situation. It's very transparent in the way you can track why a network evolved the way it did.
Yes. Could you say who you are, please?
I think I got the answer from your presentation, but I wondered if you were asked to come up with, is there one word for what a consumer wants? Or maybe what you're saying essentially is
no. That's really what we're getting at here, and that's the question that's asked of us all the time. What do consumers want? Nothing and everything.
The reason I think that's interesting is just that and informative is because there is a whole body of anthropology. I come from a department of anthropology where they do similar kinds of optimization models. What I've always thought is the problem with those is they're talking about hunter-gatherer behavior as opposed
And it's quite honestly, just as I do tried to draw the analogy between retail environment and biology and ecosystems, it's very much the same thing. It is the hunt for resources, the supply, or the supply feeding off of consumers. In this situation is consumers feeding off of their own consumers or their own resources, and very much a complex, interrelated linkage of what we think now are switches on, switches off for those needs. There is no simple answer to why this happens.
We'll take a last question from Scott.
Well, perhaps I've oversimplified what your claims were in listening to you, but I gather that you were able, in some of these complex situations, you were able to come up with what are apparently better plans and what are clearly better, more defensible plans, that is, they survive a management review better than management methods. How do you test the accuracy of your plans against the subsequent working out?
It's basically and one of the reasons we advertise the 30 years, for example, is basically over that period of time, we've been able to validate the results of these solutions against actual performance. So basically, time and time again, we can look at the way the network actually behaves in the wake of its prediction and implementation and maturity of that plan, and actually compare results, goodness of fit. So basically, it's a track record of field validation.
But you didn't show any figures.
No, I did not. I was not. I sounded too much like a field or a sales pitch to me to try to profess the accuracy of the situation.
Actually, I can see just one more, but that will be the final one. Yes, thank you.
That's in Romer from LCQ. It appeared to me that you modeled the utility of the consumers by just adding the elements like price.
No, multiple. It was basically it's a nonlinear system.
But if you also, or how do you control for the dependencies between the consumers, network effects?
Basically, what we looked at is with each and every homogeneous set of consumers, whether it's a household or a block group or enumeration area, and every retail offering, we have those geocoded, and we have decay or friction functions that define the degree of interaction between consumers and other consumers, and retail outlets and other retail outlets, and retail outlets and consumers, and so on. So it's all based upon a geocoding of latitude, longitude, and street systems. Is that?
How did you model between the consumers?
Well, basically, we put it in a simulation, something that would be considered not an origin. Are you familiar with gravity model? The gravity model concept, origin destination models. We basically turn these into the kinds of models that not near as robust as the ones that Chris is working with, but basically they're flow models. They attempt to predict the way consumers move through a marketplace using distance measures, street systems, traffic flows, those kinds of things. So we're measuring the dynamics of the marketplace.
Bryan, thank you
very much
indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.